back with this? Yes, you can. Okay. This is a good volume for everyone.
Yes.
You can hear me over here.
Yep.
All right. So, who knows that there was a Killcare Lodge that burned down in the late 40s? So said differently, only about half the room knew that. So that's going to be the thread that I pull on here, is the whole reason that there's Voyager Village is that there was a Killcare Lodge, and I'm going to talk about what led up to Killcare and then Voyager Village. I've got a bunch of little sections here. Feel free to ask questions along the way, as well as I understand we have some time at the end to go through that. And then I also heard that the power went out last month. Yeah. We're not in the middle of a storm. I hope we don't lose power because I got a lot of great slides here. So before I do get started, a couple people I wanted to thank. Jill Schaff. Jill is sitting over here. Raise your hand or stand up. Jill provided some of the information and pictures. And then right behind her, Carolyn Beidel. Last but not least, Laura Main. Anyway, so this is a culmination of a bunch of stuff that I learned along the way, that I dug up, some friends helped me find, and etc. So every good story needs a hero or heroes. So the story heroes here today are the Pines and the recreation environment that we have here in northwest Wisconsin. Who knows what a Wisconsin Kool-Aid is? The old-fashioned, yes. So those are going to be the heroes of our story. Now, who's from Chicago? Now, there's a term for you folks, but this is family friendly, so we're not going to go there. All right. Every story also has to have a villain. So the villain of this story is going to be announced later on, but there is a villain of this story. So where do we start? We start with me. I'm Rick Rumacombe, and I started coming up to this area in about 1970. The Weldon family had a place over off of 77 before you get to Webb Lake, and my mom's best friend, Jean Elmas, her family, married into the Elmas name, her family had a place that we started going to when I was a kid. That's my brother on the far right. Sadly, I couldn't find a picture of me, so I don't know what that's about. The two Elmas boys are in the middle, and their cousin on the left. So about 1970, we started coming up to this area. My most vivid memory of when I was a little kid coming up here was going to the main store. And my mom was running around with Gene Elmas, and they give us a quarter, and we go to the main store, buy a couple of pieces of candy, and it was a big, day at the store. And Laura was kind enough to give me this picture of Genevieve, who I remember very vividly, and the little track at the store was super small, and we were super excited kids to put the stuff on it. And so the main store was like my first memory. And then the Elmases bought a place in Nickaboyne Lake in 1975. The Rustic Inn sat up on the hill, and they started selling off the little lodges, and our friends, the Elmases, bought two, one for them, one for their friends. My family squatted on the friend's cabin for about 4 summers, and this is 1979, and Laura Main is this face right there in front of my Mexican friend, Juan Sanchez. And all the Hesseks and Laura had a huge crush on Juan because he spoke Spanish and was very suave. And anyway, that's me, my mom, the Elmas crew, the Hessek family, etc. So the whole reason I'm telling you that is I'm not a newbie up here, not that I was born here or whatnot, but I can go all the way back to the main store and Genevieve. All right, so in my opinion, while there's stuff before this, really the story starts with the First Nations people. And the Iroquois, which is not a name, go back to that, The Iroquois is not a name that you would think of this part of the country. Well, the reality is the Iroquois were the baddest ass Indians, and they were on the east coast, and they drove other tribes to the west. So they drove the Sioux to the west, and the Sioux at that time were two tribes. The Winnebago, otherwise known as the Ho-Chunks, settled in eastern Wisconsin, and then the Dakota went to western Wisconsin. And remember, the Iroquois is who pushed them west, so they were reacting to the tougher Iroquois at the time. Iroquois remained super tough, so the next wave of First Nations people were the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe are what we call the Council of Three Fires. There were three tribes: the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, or Ottawa as we say it, or the Potawatomi, or the Potawatomi. And so the Iroquois drove a second wave of Native Americans west. The difference between the two is the Anishinaabe went through the lakes and were kind of water people in their canoes and stuff. And so while those first two tribes were there, the second tribes through. The third three tribes came working west. To put this in perspective, the Iroquois drove the Sioux out here a couple hundred years before Columbus, and then this movement happened in the 1500s. So that's kind of where we're at from a time perspective. The Anishinaabe settled around the lakes because, again, they were water people. They also were trading with the Europeans, and the water gave them access to the Europeans, or the Europeans access to them, and so they settled around the Great Lakes. Now we're going to shift to the Ojibwe. The Ojibwe landed at basically Ashland, Wisconsin, and then they came south from there. They were migratory people. This is I thought, a cool picture that a British soldier drew of the Ojibwe family. So they came all the way through the Great Lakes and then went south into Wisconsin. And they were migratory people, followed the seasons, and followed their food sources. So to the north, they got the wild rice. They hunted in the fall. To the south, they went for the winter. They wintered down there. And then in the spring, they harvest the maple syrup and use that for all kinds of things, and then went fishing in the spring. And so those folks were in this part of the country kind of moving north and south as the seasons moved. So that's how the Ojibwe ended up here. I'll get into a little bit more of the conflict between the tribes, but that's why the Ojibwe are here. All things changed in 1634 when the first European landed at Green Bay. And they were coming through the Great Lakes and coming down from the north in Canada, following the water. And what that did is it opened up the fur trade. And the fur trade started with the French and then later became the English because the English beat them over in Europe. But the French were the ones who were here in these massive canoes. They would load up stuff, bring it out, hunt the furs, bring it back, and it was quite a tough life. The picture here, living under the canoe, that's how they lived. And all that was driven by the fur trade back in Europe.
Beaver pelts.
Yep.
If you've never been to the fort, it's kind of cool. They can do tours and tell you about what was going on. I have a little brochure here. It's kind of fun to do. What's interesting about that is you had the English and the French there because the French were first, but then they lost in the war to England. And so basically the French were the worker bees, the paddlers, and the muscle, and the English were telling them what to do. And the forts had two forts. There was basically the entrenched incumbent, and then you had kind of an also-ran. And so the forts allow you to see these two different companies over there trading, and they were trading primarily with the Ojibwe and watching out for the Dakota. Because the Dakota would come up here, and there would be conflict and some fights. In the Ojibwe were more of the traders, the water people that were interacting with ultimately the English fur traders. So from the 1500s to the mid-1700s, it was kind of a back and forth ebb and flow of, hey, we're friends, we're coexisting, but then we have conflict. And the main difference was to the north were the Ojibwe, who were moving by the water, and to the south and west The Sioux Indians, the Dakota tribe, who were more migratory with their horses, and then you had the Europeans come in and again kind of hold everybody together, which sometimes worked, sometimes didn't. And so what happened was middle part of the 1700s into the middle part of the 1800s, the cultures all clashed. And what was a coexistent environment between the tribes was no longer, because they were now fighting over territory with themselves because the Europeans were coming in, and it was just bound to end not in a good, peaceful way. The Native Americans, First Nations, were trying to figure out how to fit. The two tribes were fighting with each other, and ultimately the Ojibwe moved the Dakota further west and further south, basically for the same reason the Iroquois pushed everybody west. The Ojibwe just won the war, won the fight, and the Dakota just moved further away. However, at this time that this is going on, again, kind of the middle part of the 1800s, the Native Americans figured out that this is a losing battle and we're not going to win this battle, that being with the encroachment from America. And in the middle part of the 1800s, there were a bunch of treaties. By the way, I got about like 10 sections. Every one of these we could spend an hour on, so I'm kind of just passing through to give you a context. So in the middle 1800s, there's all these treaties happening. Treaties are being broken. The Ojibwe had pushed the Dakota to the west, and what that opened up was the timber industry. So without the treaties and without the end of the open conflict, you wouldn't have had the timber industry. So that had to happen for the timber industry to come, and that, like the fur traders before them, was a very rough life. There isn't anybody in this room that would have wanted to been a timber person. They had a rough existence. They lived in tough quarters, ate in tough quarters, worked their ass off out in the field, and they had to do the work in the winter because the general at that time moving the pines around, the general way to do it was cut it and then on the snow and the frozen ground, move it, get it to water, and then in the water in the spring when everything melts, float stuff downstream. So that was kind of what happened, and that's why you'll see towns around here by the water, and you'll also, if you do a little bit of research, find out where some of these logging camps were and the mills and stuff. And then this guy, this was the most dangerous job they had. People died like right and left doing this because these logs would get jammed up. If you fell in, you get trapped, you get crushed, etc. So I purposely put this guy's picture in here because he was, at the time, the baddest ass of all the timber guys. Either that or the most foolish, I'm not totally sure. All right, so at this point, we're in the mid-1800s and coming into the early 1900s. The white pines got fully harvested. Who can answer the question of why they went first?
They were used for construction mainly and furniture.
Construction, they were also expensive so people could make money, but the most important thing is they were light and they could float. And so the pines were very tall, straight, could be used for lumber.
Yep, I'm in a meeting.
But most importantly, they could float. And then to put another layer of context here, which is interesting, is the fort slide that was active in 1803, 1804, and now we're 75 years later, and the next thing that happens is the railroads come. Mm. So you're talking about 75 years, which went from fur trading out of a canoe to having railroads and schooner. So that's a very fast evolution of how things happen. And if you can't see this in the back, this top slide says railroads built by 1870, and the bottom slide by 1890. So you didn't really get much past the Mississippi, and you didn't have much in the South. and the country was covered 20 years later.
Wow.
So again, trading furs in 1803, 1804 out of a canoe, and you got the railroads coming through by 1890. And in schooner, 1879. Actually went to a little town that's now a ghost town, a little north, like 3 miles north of Spooner, but the water went bad, and so they moved the railroad stop a couple miles south to Spooner. Spooner was a complete railroad town. It was built because of the railroad, right where it was, and built around the railroad. You can't see in the back. These are the railroad tracks right here. The town was built around the railroad. The kind of town square of its time was built right next to the depot, and actually it's kind of cool, the depot's still there.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
No, go on.
Okay. So right now, so at this point, we're now around 1900, early part of the 1900s. The timber industry, remember, the first path they went through and got all the pines. And then they went back and got the hardwoods. And why could they do that? They had the railroad. So the whole water movement of the timber south, when it goes away, and now you're moving everything by the railroad, which just feeds into why the railroad was important and all the towns that were built, etc. Put this in context. Out of Wisconsin, almost 53 billion feet of board was harvested. So if you cut that into a 1 inch by 12 inch piece of wood, you could build a roadway a half a mile wide around the world. So the timber that was taken out of Wisconsin is almost kind of mind-blowing. All right, but what did that do?
People.
Yes, but guess what? You had a lot of stuff that got clear cut. We'll get there. A couple steps ahead. So now you got all this land that has been clear cut, and people have to say, well, what are we going to do with that? So you had two forces going on here. You had the government and you had the timber companies, who then started pushing this concept of you can farm here, and happy land was a term that they branded and marketed in 100 different ways. Here's two pieces, happy land, happy homes. And it went out not only across the country, but around the world, that you could come to Wisconsin and farm. Okay, however, I don't know about you, but that doesn't look like it's going to be super easy to farm. The other issue we have, as we all know, because I was talking to somebody over there on that side of the room, summer's already feeling like it's on the way out. Super short grow season, and up here, the soil's not that good. It's not horrible, but it's not that good. So you got this kind of land, you got other people saying, hey, come farm, and people from around, not only the country, but around the world, came here to farm. And that's what it looked like. Not very good. In fact, I found this picture. The best way to get rid of these stumps was to blow them up. So there are actually groups like this that some of them government organized to go around and blow up the stumps. And you get hard to see in the very back, but it says fuse products if used right, and it shows the dude running from the stump. This was not also that guy who was like working on the logs in the river. He had a rough job. These guys probably a rough job too. All right, so then what happens? All right, we got all these people coming from around the world. 1927, there's 4.5 million acres of farmland that's tax delinquent. Not all these people, a lot of people failed. So what did that lead to? 1933, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, had 128 camps sprinkled throughout Wisconsin, And they planted 265 million trees in Wisconsin and 3 billion throughout the United States. And they played into, again, the year here is 1933, so what do we have then? We have the Depression, and we say, hey, if you're a young man looking for opportunity and work and want to, go see the world and do strong things, come work for us. And the camps might be hard to see in the back. The little triangles, tons up there, some through here. And they reforested Wisconsin. This camp is a little bit to the north. Gives you an idea of, well, it looked a lot like the logging camps. And those people just walked around in the woods and planted trees. Again, the years 1933 and a couple of years after that. Yeah.
Was it seeds or was it like little saplings?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I only found a couple pictures. I didn't do tons of research like on this section. Like I said, all these sections could be explored. I only saw people walking around with, I didn't see any like saplings. They're, like this picture, if you look close, and other pictures I saw, look like it was seeds.
What kind of tree?
I think it's just everything that you see here. Probably a lot of what they found, which was pines and stuff, but I don't know. All right, so that opened up a resort era that mainly started because the train stopped in Spooner, and the main thing was the trains, and also as people moved to the bigger city in the summer, the city was hot and oppressive, etc. But like when the timber companies went through and cut everything down, they then were like, hey, we got all this land, what are we going to do with it? Well, who drove the resort era? The railroads. Railroads said, hey, we built a railroad, we moved all this wood, now what do we do? They're like, oh, we're going to sell this area as recreation. So you can see this is sponsored by Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul Pacific. And so the railroads really were in the, up here anyway, also in the recreation business. This is from February 7th, 1924, Burnett County, great tourist pleasure ground. There's a bunch of other stories about this. But the government was also pushing, hey, we got to figure out, the farming's not working so good, so we got to come up with a new spin. And tourism was part of that story. And it created a whole culture, kind of a resort culture, which to some degree is still here today. The area, Webster, over to Spooner, over to Hayward, became very famous. I think I got this from Laura or Jill, but why you can't read it in the back. Some of the stuff I wanted to include. Anyway, there's 18 resorts all right around Webb Lake. And it lists them all, including Killcare Lodge, which I am going to get to. Grover, Elmore, Webb Lake. And they had, let's see here, we have what was then Romer's, Webb Lake Hotels, the Lumberjack, Ivan Johnson's Webb Lake Resort Hotel. That's who built the Cabaret. That was kind of a lodge for them. So anyway, some of the same names that you might remember. Here's Ivan Johnson and his family and their ad. I love the Cabaret, and since they were the origins of the Cabaret, that's why they're kind of a fan favorite for me. But what's interesting, the peak of this era, I put 40s to 60s. You could maybe bleed it down a little bit more, but there were 275 resorts in Burnett County. Wow. And this was a report put together by Wayne Burmeister, who has passed now. And I got this from the women that work at the historical, Burnett County Historical Society at the fort. They helped me find a bunch of different things that have been a great resource for me. And they created this map. Doesn't show very well, but if you go to the forts, they have little pins for all the resorts that they found, and I'm sure there's others that they didn't find. So, for example, on Birch Island Lake, for those of you who knew, we had Killcare and then Voyager. There were actually, at one point, 2 other resorts on the lake. there also were 4 or 5 dairy farms on the lake. And anyway, this is just kind of a cool map if you end up going to the forts. It's very interesting. All right, so we got the reforestation going on. We got a depression going on. Farming didn't work so well, so we got all these things happening. And then we added some fuel to the fire. What was that?
Voyager Village.
Prohibition. So we outlawed booze. All right, so who's really close to Canada? Wisconsin. And what is connected from Wisconsin via highway, Chicago, and the gangsters thought that, you know, they could capitalize on that, but also the moonshiners. There's somebody I'm looking right at right now that people in her family, or the family she married into, were moonshiners. So you had kind of a whole moonshining thing going on up here, and you had the gangsters. And somebody over there before we talked, or before we got going, said, hey, what's the story with the gangsters? This could be its own hour or its own 5 hours. Just have a handful of slides, but it's real. So for those of you in the back, can't see, got all these triangles of gangster, basically hotspots, and throughout the state. And you know, that's just the stuff that they know about, right? So, and why is that so easy? Is you can go from Chicago straight to Lake Geneva, and from there, and like this was like gangster corridor leading from Chicago up into Wisconsin. And as we saw before, you know, this is backwoods, right? So you're out in the forest, and great place to hide and fly stuff in. Did anybody here know that Al Capone had a spot in Coudray? Mm-hmm. Okay, so at his hideaway, there are gun turrets, long narrow lake. You could put in a float plane. You could drop barrels in there. So Al Capone was up here. I didn't know this guy till I researched this talk. So Joe Saltis was public enemy number 9. Doesn't mean a lot to me other than this means he's kind of a bad hombre. Well, turns out Joe and Al Capone were considered country gentlemen by one of the newspapers up here because they had spots and probably were, you know, throwing their money around a little bit and being nice to the authorities and etc. However, Prohibition came to an end. It's now 1933. Kind of think, well, then that's the end of the gangsters up here. It's not. So Al Capone goes to jail for tax evasion and other tax crimes in the 30s, and one of his lieutenants, Joey Doves, Ayupa, was up in this area, and he, over a course of actually a couple decades, basically consolidated a lot of the gangster mob activity in Chicago and became almost one of the head guys that you've never heard of, because I'm assuming that, because I didn't know him. But he was up here, and his nickname, the Joey Doves, is because he got caught from the local authorities, and he had like 500 birds in his trunk. And, you know, of course, you're only supposed to have 5 or something. And so, anyway, he earns this reputation as a bad gangster, and tying us in with up here, over in Hayward at the Chippewa Flowage, Louis Spray catches the world's largest muskie in 1949, and tying those two threads together, the urban legend is that Joey Doves caught the muskie, didn't want anybody to, you know, see him, and gave it to Louis Spray. So I'm not going to tell, I did a little bit of work there. I'm not going to give you that other than it's kind of an interesting story, and a lot of people have written about it. So we got gangsters up here, and that leads us to Birch Island Lake. We got about 800-ish acres, depending on how high the water is. And this is what Kilcare Road looked like in the 1930s.
So today.
People traveled with axes and saws in their trunk, because if you came across somebody, you know, you might not have anywhere to go, and you might have to chop something down, or the water might have washed out the road, or whatever. So they traveled trying to prepare themselves for whatever they might find. For those of you who don't know, the Birch Island camp is straight across the water on this big peninsula over here. Those folks were coming up from Iowa and Nebraska in the late 1800s by the railroad. A day's wagon travel with supplies, and they stayed up here for the summer and then would go back at the end of the summer. Had a big swath of land over there. There were a number of families that were over there, interestingly enough, without property lines. They had communal, it's kind of a commune ahead of its time. They had communal eating and sharing of certain things. But those folks started coming here late 1800s, early 1900s, and this is what their festivities look like. All right, so that leads us up to how I started, which is Kilcare Lodge. Kilcare Lodge, the Kilcare Lodge, not this Kilcare Lodge, the Kilcare Lodge is down Bridge Road, about 2/3 of the way down before you get to the causeway. There's a little ridge. Where Ken and Norma go? Oh, right here. Right about where Ken and Norma's cabin sits, because it's the highest point, and we'll look at some other pictures later. You can see kind of the picturesque main part was at the peak, and then everything kind of went down from there. A guy by the name of Charles, otherwise known as C.E. Hatcher, purchased a lot of land around here in 1909, and it took him 6 years to build what was then called Point Kilcare. And Mick Peterson, I thought might come. I don't see him here. I got this picture from Mick Peterson when Mick Peterson was a younger man, one of the managers of the big lodge that burned, handed him this and said, this picture, and said, hey, I think this might be of interest to you. Mick, a couple of years back, said, hey, I got this picture, but it was all rolled up like the scroll of the Dead Sea, and I had to do some work to make it look like this. And here's a little more visual. 1922, Point Kilcare. And if you can't see it back here, got a Model T here. And we got some folks all dressed up. If you take a magnifying glass to look at it, you know, it could be a wedding or something. They are dolled up over there on the far left. And here's a couple images of what that property looked like. And they were advertising. So the proprietor was a pretty good marketer. He was advertising, running ads in the Minneapolis Journal in 1924. Had this brochure. And then this one, I love this one. Again, the ladies at the Burnett County Historical Society helped me find this particular piece, but this was not together any longer, and like in pieces of paper that looked like it was going to fall apart just touching it. But anyway, so in the mid 1920s, they start advertising things. And they were pretty smart, because one of the things they did, they said no mosquitoes.
That was false advertising.
Same one for a while.
No, that's right.
And again, this is all Bridge Road, right? So it's right down there. Little cottages. They talked about health. The high altitude combined with cool, dry air affords quick relief to a variety of things: hay fever, asthma, etc. And then the eating is of interest to me. because the caption here says fishermen cooking dinner on sandbar between point and the island. Looked at this picture a bunch with the magnifying glass. I think this is close to the point, looking toward the point for a couple different reasons. But that's one of the pictures that obviously is important to me. And talk about the game with an Indian guide and his family. Again, this is 1920s. The fishing, the boating and bathing, and the bathing, mermaids sunning themselves on Birch Island Beach. And then another picture that's relevant to my world, on the bridge between point and island. This is looking at the island, nothing on the island. This was a sandbar. You can see water coming through there, and basically a catwalk. And you can see the clothes they're wearing. The ladies were, covered with probably like 3 different layers of stuff. And then the story, a lot of people ask about the causeway. Well, it was a sandbar. Water went down in the Dust Bowl, and they could drive cars across. And then when the water came back in the 40s, the people who had been used to driving their cars across didn't like it. And so the woman who bought I'm going to get to some of the cottages later, but the woman who had bought the first cabin at the time on the island, she hired a couple of high schoolers, and they built the causeway one summer in the late 40s. There was a lawsuit over who could use it, so there was a legal document that you could go through and read it. So the causeway was built by hand, a couple of high schoolers and this lady in the late 40s. And now you can imagine you'd be out there and the DNR would have you in about 12 minutes. So anyway, sandbar island with nothing on it, and this is the mid-1920s. They were fishing. And then another thing that I noticed here is the guys, almost all of them were wearing hats in the 1920s. So this guy, both of these guys, they also were wearing suit coats.
Yes.
So that's kind of an interesting little tidbit from that point in time. Talk about the water, caption a sweep of the shore showing the point, and way back there you can kind of see the big lodge sitting there. Here they were calling this Point Kilcare Cottage, which was the bigger lodge at that time. And again, guys wearing hats and jackets. It was a family thing, though. They were marketing it to women and kids. So the C.E. Hatcher did a pretty good job of, for his time, trying to market it to a group of people and had the foresight to buy a lot of property. And so that was what I was calling Kilcare Lodge number 1, which then led to Kilcare Lodge number 2, which also could have been called the Big Lodge, 1929. Grover Elmore leads a business group, and they build the Big Lodge. I've heard 2 different things about the smaller lodge. Heard it burned, heard they just tore it down and built this. I don't know which one's which, but we ended up with Kilcare Lodge, and this is what it looked like from the lake, looking at Cananorma's crest on Bridge Road. And as you drove in on Bridge Road, to the left side of this picture, that's the kind of the peak there on the right side that was kind of the main picture that people say. So I'd be on the left and the road would take you up. So this is like kind of the side entrance. So you come up with your car, side entrance again. And then this postcard tells you how to get here from Chicago. So it shifted when they built this bigger lodge, which was actually a city club and a private club mostly, not 100%, but mostly. It was heavily marketed toward Chicago. So this was a postcard that just said, here's how you get here from Chicago. Down by the water, looking up. They used a variety of different interesting architectural things. This is a picture of their lobby. Another close-up on the lobby. Their dining room sat 200 people.
Wow.
So this was a big deal, a really big deal. And lots of stories actually with a couple people that are still here in this area whose family worked there or were in the ownership group. And the gangsters were here, and there were guys with machine guns standing out at the road. And it was a Chicago City Club with Chicago kind of clientele. You know what I mean? They also had white tablecloths, and it was meant to be kind of an upscale experience. Actually trying to separate itself from a business perspective from the other more kind of mom and pop resorts. Nothing against those, just, hey, this is a slightly different experience. This was a map, like old maps you'd have in your glove box in your car, and that's kind of the money shot for Killcare Lodge, which again was built in the late 20s, and we'll talk about what happened to it. The map here shows you, here's how you get from Chicago. And this cabin is the first cabin when you go to Bridge Road and you hang a left. The first cabin on the water is this cabin right here. And kind of an interesting thing here is how the clothes had changed. Hats go away, sport coats go away, but what comes into scene at this point are ties. They start wearing ties, and they're this is fancy, right? White tablecloths and the service that they're getting and such. So it was a high-end club. This is a postcard of, again, kind of that money shot of what Killcare used to look like. And then this is 1929, and they talk about the old clubhouse and then the new clubhouse. And they had a farm, so it's kind of the farm to table or farm to fork. And I included this because I thought the logo was cool. And I thought Annie Lamert might be here. I didn't see her come in. Annie's my neighbor. Her grandfather was on the board, and he's one of the names on the right-hand side, Mark Vaughan. And actually, he was the one who sued the Normandies about using the causeway. So the first lawsuit started with Annie's grandfather against the lady who owned the first cabin over the causeway. That's where some of the earlier stuff came in. And then this is kind of fun. From the 40s, you could stay in a cottage for $3.50 a day, including food. If you stayed for a full week, $21. And if you wanted to be in the new clubhouse that had a connecting bath, $5 a day. And the old clubhouse without the connecting bath, $4 a day, or $25 a day. And they had.
Do you have any of those forms here to fill out?
We wish, right? So Killcare Lodge had a bunch of cottages. So the very first one, I can't read it from the back, but it says the Elmore cabin. Grover Elmore, again, was the point person who pulled, and I'm talking about him a little bit more in upcoming slides. He was the front man for pulling the big Killcare Lodge together. So the very first one was the Elmore cabin. And then this one, the Elmore cabin, the very first one is this one, and that's the second one. They're both still standing. And then this one could be, anybody, a number of people here might know the Solons. The Solons and the Petersons next to them, both of those structures are from Killcare. This is smaller, could be one of those two, although they both have had additions, so you can't fully kind of tell whether it is or it isn't. This one says cottage Killcare Club. Well, that was another interesting thing. They called it Point Killcare, they called it Killcare Club, they called it Killcare Lodge, they called this the Killcare Club. So there was a lot of different verbiage going on. It also, they were marketing it from being from Webster, because the train also went to Webster or Spooner or Webb Lake, and then Webb Lake had multiple spellings. So there was kind of interesting things about how they positioned that. And then, who recognizes this one? That's my cabin, or my family's cabin. And that was called the John Clark cabin. This picture is back on the wall on the left, and John Clark built my family's cabin. And John was one of the ownership group that Grover Elmore had to build the lodge. John Clark was from North Carolina, and he started calling our place when he built it Pinehurst Lodge, hence the shirt that I have here and the brand that we run with in our family. So John Clark was in the ownership group of the big lodge. John Clark built our family cabin after the lodge got finished in 29. And given the different pictures, I think architecturally there's a lot of similarities. My guess is that whoever built the lodge just said, hey, go down there and build me one down there. All right. So why, other than that it was here, is Killcare Lodge important? They had a farm. And the farm was important because if you get up here, you have to feed everybody and all that kind of stuff. But what else would maybe this have led to? Cleaned a lot of land that is right behind me. Where the par 3 is, was the Killcare farm. And why else is Killcare important? They built the golf course. It was 9-hole sand greens right up over here, primarily the back, kind of the back end of the back 9 that we now have was built by Killcare in the 1920s. And then again, the lodge was up and running as a business through the late 40s. The staff was all very well dressed. Again, it was high-end white tablecloth. And they tried to dress up the experienced city club, trying to appeal to Chicago people, etc. The guests, again, comparing to the 20s, we're now, this picture's 1938. Women are wearing dresses way smaller than they were before. The guys have ditched the hats and the coats, but the guys have ties on, or at least some of them. Of everything, this is, I think I like this picture more than any of the other ones. Some college kids from the late 30s. A little tough to see, but I like this picture because of the water pictures at Killcare Lodge. They always had a very impressive dock. So you got the dock here, you got a couple that's for their era, dressed very handsomely. And they also were, as we've seen in all the pictures, still big Fisher people here. This is actually Grover Elmore's wife, Helen. She'll become more important in the story as we go forward. So a few other things that were of interest. Grover Elmore was a real estate developer out of Chicago. He pulled an ownership group together. They bought the land. They built the big lodge. Kind of a high society guy. I got a bunch of pictures here from different people on the lake. There is somebody on the lake who actually, Grover is the great-grandfather. I don't know, how much those people want to share, but there are people here on the lake that go back to Grover. And he built a summer home in 1948 for $45,000. That was in a newspaper article, which I'll get to in a moment. Wow. And I kind of thought, well, that sounds like a lot of money. How much is that today? So I got a little inflation calculator thing on the web, and 32 and a half times from 48 to now turns 45,000 into 1.47 million. And that's what 1.47 million bought you in 1948.
That's it. This is it.
And guess what? It's this fireplace that you're looking at.
Yes. Wow.
So this was Grover Elmore's private residence that he was building in 1948.
Wow.
Grover's family, looking up a little incline there at this picture. I don't know. I didn't do the math to try to figure out when this was. Late 40s, 50s, somewhere in there. So what else has ties to Kilcare Lodge? But one of my favorite spots, the Cabaret, which was named at the time the Webb Lake Country House. And the Cabaret, it's still the picture's not a very good picture, but I just like the image. Cabaret was built for a couple of different reasons. Red Johnson on Des Moines Lake had their resort. They wanted a place like all these resorts had lodges. They wanted their own lodge. They wanted to dress it up a little bit, kind of like Kilcare. So they had the music dome, and guess what? They had white tablecloths and nice tables and nice chairs. And guess what? These are Kilcare tablecloths, chairs, and tables. They would run those in on the weekends and dress it up, and some of the workers from Kilcare would go over there and work. And they also, Kilcare was trying to give people a little something more to do, and then also get some of the noise away from the lodge. Which actually the Solons, for those of you who know the Solons was the bar. And so for the people who wanted to stay up a little later and be a little more rowdy, they'd go down to the Solon cabin and hang out down there. Pre-Solons, obviously. So the Cabaret was intended to dress up a little bit the experience that people were having and to pull the Chicago clientele from Kilcare on the weekends. And that leads us to the Five Lakes Club. This was something I found a year or two ago. Has anybody ever heard of the Five Lakes Club? Yeah. All right, one person. She's probably the one who told me, probably.
I remember the Voyager.
Okay, so what's interesting about that is that in a way that was a precursor for Voyager Village. Buy a bunch of land, get people to get property, and on the map here, can't see it obviously, 2.5 miles wide, 3.5 miles long, the whole southern half of Birch Island Lake, the eastern part of Sand Lake, and they wanted to do, in a way, kind of what Voyager ended up doing a couple decades later. So what happened to Kilcare? Burned down. April 1948, upper left-hand corner, Kilcare Lodge destroyed by a fire last Wednesday. Front page story in the Spooner newspaper. And this is actually where they said that Grover Elmore was building the $45,000 home. That's where I got that information. A couple different stories about what happened there. This talks about they were trying to build a walk-in cooler and it went bad, and I don't know if it was propane or whatever they were using to do whatever they were doing. That's one version. The walk-in cooler explodes, everything's wood, and it goes. The other different people is that they were trying to seal the roof and were basically heating up tar, and it spills, starts on fire, and the whole thing goes. So from over here, actually, at that kind of angle, somewhere over here. Might even be from this property, I don't know. That's what it looked like when it burned down. And sadly, that's what it looked like afterwards.
Oh.
That beautiful resort. And this is what it turned into. Yes?
Any loss of life or injury?
No loss of life. And the story about the walk-in cooler was a father-son tandem working on it, and they skedaddled out of there.
Yeah.
That's one version. I don't know if it's true. All right. So, checking on the time, we're pushing an hour. Keep going?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Keep going? All right. So, now we're at Voyager Village. It's 1969, 1970. And honestly, in my opinion, this is Care Lodge number 3. Number 1 was the smaller one. Number 2 is the bigger one. And it led to this. And this is Annie Isaacson, who was the developer, business guy, real estate developer. It was a very elaborate plan. And of all the stories that I heard of this development and all the years I've been here, I didn't know this till I read this. There was a man-made lake involved. Who knew that? A couple, like 3-4 people. I didn't know that till I started doing this particular presentation. So this is Shoal Lake, that's Cadott, and this whole big piece in there, they were going to do a man-made lake, which was kind of Isaacson's thing. And this is their marketing language, the Midwest leading and most experienced recreational lakeland developer. I'm going to explore a little bit about him doing this project, but honestly, him creating lake living was what he was doing. So if there was somebody capable of doing it, despite some of the negativity, which I'll get into, he wasn't a bad guy to try to do it. So what did Annie Isaacson, Ike see? My opinion as a business guy, he saw the mom and pop era ending. He saw the suburbs expanding, and there was this property right here that, now at this point, Grover's passed. Helen owns more than 600 acres. She's got the golf course. This is Mrs. Elmore's course. That's what it was called, Mrs. Elmore's course. She's got that. She's got this. And she's got some property on Bridge Road, and then a lot of stuff this way. Again, over 600 acres. The course was rugged, black and hat. For those of you who aren't golfers or didn't know this, the greens were sand, and they drizzle oil, and then run things. We got some golfers in the back, and I'm like, I know what that is. And then they would run rollers over to pack it down really hard. And probably, I'm imagining before Voyager showed up, it was probably pretty rugged. But again, at this point, Helen had gotten pretty old, and they weren't running Kill Care anymore and stuff. But this was Mrs. Elmore's whacking up there. What was the other thing that he saw? As a business guy, this was the most interesting thing I found about his desire to do this, which is, can't see in the back, this is Interstate Highways of Minnesota, autumn of 1970. See the Twin Cities here, you got this loop that was being built. This was open in 1969. This was open in 1969. This was open in 67. And this was open 72 and 73. He looked at what was going on and said, hey, all those people from the Twin Cities can get in their car and they can drive up here for way faster than they could before. As a business guy, I think this was brilliant. he front ran 35W being built. So despite all the negativity, so I have this one last, like, what did he do? What did he see? Again, you're looking for ideas and things that drive an investment decision. He saw this. What did he do right? He was going to leave over 50% of the acres in its natural habitat. He was going to do all the amenities, which truthfully was what the Five Lakes Club was going to do. And a lot of these things Kilcare had already started. And I didn't know this, he was going to create a man-made rapids off of this point, the par 3 that sticks out in the lake, this little device that was going to run water up and drop it to try to oxygenate the water to make it more palatable for the fish. So whether or not it was going to work, I don't know, but it sounded cool. And then, again, I'm talking about what did he do right. What he did, I've had many people ask me this, well, why is nobody on the water? His idea was that he was going to cluster and set back people from the water, which was going to allow everybody access to the water, and cluster it here so that he wasn't going to chew up the whole thing. So we'll get to some of the negative stuff in a moment, but he did do some things right as far as trying to make this a development that would work. What didn't he see? It was a very ambitious plan. Probably was too big. He definitely underestimated the not in my backyard. Got pushed back on he was going to build a lake, and he kind of thought that the area was going to embrace the economic development because there were a lot of articles about, hey, it was going to bring tens of millions of dollars to the area, and it was going to do this, and it was going to do that. He overestimated that, but probably of these things, the worst one was the economy went bad in the early 70s. We had gas lines, high inflation, economy was crappy, stagflation, and probably the nail in the coffin was everybody was going to have septic. And he wanted 4,000 lots. 4,000 lots. So he probably shot a little too high and probably missed the mark on a few things.
Yes.
So what did that lead to? A really big fight. A really big fight. There were lawsuits, social unrest. I'll get into some of that here. But it wasn't without people wanting to do it. So there were like two camps. You're in the for and the against, and things were heated. So Ike Isaacson is the Darth Vader of the story. To this day, he gets painted as a really bad guy. And a bad project, and this and that. As an independent, not picking a side, as an independent looking at it, I think he tried to do a lot of things right. And I think he saw some interesting cultural shifts. And had he tweaked a few things, he might have had a success. Also, timing and luck is involved, and the economy turned against him. So you have the local fight, which was driven in large part about the water, which was the lake and the septic systems, and the air. He wanted to bring the air quality. Mm-hmm. And so they were looking at air pollution and noise pollution, and thinking that we were going to have an international airport here or something. And I can hear an occasional airplane, but not much. It's not that big of a deal, right?
Right.
Things got so testy that the First Bank of Grantsburg got drawn in because people were spelling. I'm going to say a couple stories here. People were spinning so many bad things about them, didn't have the money, didn't have the loans, this and that. So the First Bank of Grantsburg runs an ad and says, hey, we did our due diligence. The guy, as far as we could tell, is legit. So this was hot, right? You had the for, you had the against. They got the banks coming out saying, hey, it's okay. It got so bad that Isaacson sued this nonprofit that got formed to fight Isaacson. And he said, you know, you're slandering me, you're doing this, you're that. So there's this big lawsuit. I didn't have any catchy headlines to take a picture of, but there were two things that were especially noteworthy here that I'll just give you verbally. Number one, there was vandalism going on. And his property was being vandalized, and his signs on where to go and stuff like that were being taken. And it got, yes?
What would have been the year of this lawsuit?
I'm not sure. Ken, I'll have to dig that up. The project was not launched yet. I'll get to the launching in a moment. This is like in the middle of, can we get past? Webb Lake changed their zoning. There was a fight about, can they do that? So the cities and the townships were changing zoning. He's getting his signs pulled up. He's getting his stuff vandalized, and he's Darth Vader. Okay, so the two things were a bunch of vandalism. The local sheriff had to issue a reward for, somebody can tell me about this. So the sheriff had to come in and say, come on, people, let's be adults here. And then the other thing that was interesting is there were two people in this organization who were taking signs, and the one person told the second person, hey, go take some signs. The second person comes back, and the first person with the signs, first person throws them under the bus, turns them in. And it was kind of one of those deals where, like, somebody who lights a fire and then puts it out to be a hero, they wanted to draw attention to the anti-development message. So these two people in the same organization, one guy throws the other guy under the bus. The second guy sues the first guy to say, hey, don't throw me under the bus. And when it went to court, the second guy was proven to be correct. So things were very nasty, like very nasty. But they got to the finish line, Ken. And they developed it and they launched it. And maybe the last thing I'd say about Isaacson is he was pretty good with the media. He knew what he was doing from marketing the thing, and in particular, this one was funny. Who remembers Boone and Erickson from CCO? They're, daily, right? Good materials for its time. This is 1970, 71, 72. Good materials. And they open it. Now, it's in okay, Ken, to your point, here's September 71. The lawsuit happened ahead of this. So a couple things go on. He settles with Webb Lake. He's got to scale back how many lots, which then puts pressure on making money on the project. So he scales back to get over that hump. And things start to turn sideways here. But they get it up and running. They open the clubhouse. They were very good marketers. They had these newsletters that they were mailing out to the local people. And they wanted to dress it up, right? Clubhouse, golf course, the airstrip. They did full-page ads in the Star Tribune. Probably spent a fortune on CCO and Star Tribune articles. And that gets us to today, which close would be, hey,